Good morning from Washington, D.C., and welcome everyone to a webinar discussion with the Task Force on Climate Development and the International Monetary Fund on the role of the IMF in helping mitigate climate risk. The task force is a collaboration of experts from around the world utilizing rigorous empirical research to advance a development-centered approach to climate policy at the IMF. As the only multilateral rules-based institution charged with promoting the stability of the international financial and monetary system, the IMF has a central role to play in the transition to an adapted, resilient, and low-carbon global economy. My name is Sarah Jane Ahmed, Finance Advisor to the Vulnerable Group of 20, the V20 Ministers of Finance. And I will be moderating today's discussion with closing remarks from Marilu Uy, Director of the Secretariat of the Intergovernmental Group of 24 on International Monetary Affairs and Development, the G24. The latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report has made it clear that this decade is our now or never for decisive action. Overshooting 1.5 degrees, even temporarily, leads to severe and irreversible outcomes, increasing heat waves, longer droughts, extreme precipitation, and more intense tropical cyclones. Under high warming scenarios, large areas will be uninhabitable, requiring migration and relocation. The international community is already beginning to feel the pressure from climate change as extreme weather events rocked economies around the world in 2021, and impacts are only expected to worsen as we are off track and on the road to breach the 1.5 centigrade survival limit of the Paris Agreement. Beyond physical climate risks, countries are also coping with other climate-related economic challenges. Transitioning away from volatile fossil fuels requires modernization of the power system and finding new sustainable revenue streams, and countries rapidly implementing climate policies like carbon taxes can have spillover effects on other economies, particularly emerging market and developing economies. A coordinated global approach will be crucial to ensuring a swift and inclusive green transition. With its mandate to maintain international financial stability, the IMF is uniquely positioned to take the lead on ushering in a new era to support climate resilient development. A series of new technical papers from the Task Force on Climate Development and the IMF rigorously assesses the various economic impacts from climate change and policy responses to climate change. The IMF's climate strategy was released last August, and its latest comprehensive surveillance review also incorporates climate change. A newly released fiscal monitor chapter focuses on the need for an internationally coordinated approach to carbon pricing. These papers from the task force seek to inform the IMF's work on climate change and touch on three areas: fiscal impacts, spillover transition risks, and physical climate risks. On that note, it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists for today. Mahjot is Director of the Macro and Green Finance Lab at the National School of Development, Peking University, and the founder and president of the Institute of Finance and Sustainability based in Beijing. He's also the chairman of the Green Finance Committee of China Society for Finance and Banking, co-chair of the G20 Sustainable Finance Study Group, and co-chair of the steering committee of the Climate Investment Principles for the Belt and Road. He's joined by He Xiaobei, Deputy Director of the Macro and Green Finance Lab at the National School of Development, Peking University. She conducts research on topics related to macroeconomics, monetary policy, financial stability, and climate policies. Previously, she was a research fellow at Tsinghua University and an economist with a think tank. Rakesh Mohan is president and distinguished fellow at CSEP. Rakesh was most recently senior fellow in the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs, Yale University, and a professor in the practice of international economics and finance at the School of Management of Yale University. He has been closely associated with the Indian economic reforms process from the late 1980s. He was executive director on the board of the International Monetary Fund, deputy governor of the Reserve Bank of India, secretary of economic affairs, and chief economic advisors of the Indian Ministry of Finance, and economic advisor in the Ministry of Industry. Laurence Toubiana is CEO of the European Climate Foundation and a professor at Sciences Po, Paris. She previously chaired the Board of Governors at the French Development Agency, as well as the Board of Expertise France. Before joining ECF, Laurence was France's climate change ambassador and special representative for COP21, and as such a key architect of the landmark Paris Agreement. Following COP21 and through COP22, she was appointed the UN High-Level Champion for Climate Action. She also served as senior advisor on environment to the French Prime Minister Lionel Jospin and created and led the newly established Directorate for Global Public Goods at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and founded and directed the Institute of Sustainable Development and International Relations. It is a pleasure to have you all here. And before turning over to our panelists, I want to mention that this is a webinar and it is being live streamed on YouTube, so a recording is immediately accessible. Please use the Q&A box located in your Zoom menu to ask questions to the panelists, and please give your name and affiliation. We will also take questions after panelists' remarks, but please feel free to enter the questions at any time during the discussion. So to kick off our event today, we are honored to first hear opening remarks from His Excellency Mambure Nyai, the Minister of Finance and Economic Affairs from the Gambia, on perspectives from the V20 on the urgency of our discussion.
Good morning, everyone. Greetings from Banjul, the Republic of the Gambia. My name is Mambure Nyai, and I am the Minister of Finance and Economic Affairs of the Gambia. I am pleased to give opening remarks as a member of the V20 and especially to provide perspectives from an LDC and Africa. I appreciate and welcome the task force efforts to advance rigorous empirical research to inform the IMF's approach to addressing the climate emergency in a manner that supports the development aspirations of countries around the world. I am very glad that think tanks and partners from around the world have convened together to advance a development-oriented vision for climate change. Additionally, I have the following 6 views to share. First, the IMF has a central role to play in global policy coordination and in navigating financial shocks. We therefore look forward to support as we continue to navigate climate shocks. As climate change intensified and arising from the findings of the IPCC ARC reports, it must be noted that growing losses and damages due to insufficient adaptation response and a 98% prevailing financial protection gap is a fast emerging major macroeconomic concern for the V20. Second, the IPCC reports confirm that Africa is the most vulnerable by all metrics. And as the IPCC's latest report has made it clear, this decade could well be our own or never moment. To support climate action at such a scale and time frame, we need international institutions to play an important role in fostering an internationally resourced and orderly transition to a climate resilient and low carbon sustainable economy. Some of the papers produced by the task force highlighted the cross-border macroeconomic impact of climate policies. The IMF is uniquely situated to help countries understand how these cross-border spillovers may affect their economies. But more importantly, this builds the case for the urgency, scale, and quality of resources and funds to be made available for climate vulnerable countries, which are least responsible for climate emergencies. The IMF modeling tool have to be fit for climate prosperity, and it can support efforts to expedite access to resources, especially LDCs and capacity development in finance ministries around the world to effectively manage the full range of climate risks to support our development efforts. Working together with the multilateral development banks, the IMF has a critical role to play to help countries mobilize finance from official sources and private capital. Carbon taxes alone will not be sufficient to meet the investment needs required to transition to a low-carbon climate resilience pathway. The international public finance community and key central banks can certainly help with immediate liquidity issues and support innovative proposals to ensure there is cash on hand for LDCs to invest in climate fuel impacts. We know that investing in climate resilience now pay off multiple folds in the future. But to invest today, resources must be made available. At this stage, I wish to observe that the Resilient and Sustainability Trust Fund, RST, by the IMF is a welcome step towards making available resources for climate vulnerable economies. We hope that this can enhance public sector funding and debt management strategies by supporting the diversification of government revenues from high-risk sectors. The RST can also complement policy frameworks that facilitate adaptations, resilient building, and least disruptive green transition. The RST may also consider supporting country-led policy development where needed. To be more useful, the RST can be periodically reviewed in scope and potentially expanded over time to anticipate the dynamic and differentiated needs of climate-vulnerable developing countries. This can be done through structured institutional dialogues with the V20s on the expansion of the RST over time. Before I end my opening remarks, I would like to share a point of reflection. Just last week, we had a meeting with V20 and G20 representatives, along with other stakeholders under the INSO Resilience Global Partnership on dealing with losses and damages through the G7 presidency-led global shield. I co-chaired this meeting with Germany, the current G7 presidency. I bring this up because we are working together to chart progress in closing the financial protection gap. This partnership is quite unique because it clearly has V20 representations. We must recognize that climate vulnerable countries' representation in global governance decision-making remains weak and continue to result in outcomes that do not go far enough to protect the interests of the world's most vulnerable groups on the planet. Inclusivity in decision-making processes will be measured by the extent to which the V20 and other LDCs are represented. On behalf of the V20, I commend the efforts of the task force as you continue to pioneer research in the field of climate, development, and the IMF. Thank you for your kind attention.
We thank His Excellency for sharing an important message, especially on the urgency, scale, and quality of resources and funds that need to be made available for climate-vulnerable countries who are least responsible for the climate emergency. And following that important message, now we turn to Mahjot and He Xiaobei for a brief presentation on the latest task force research on transition spillover risks. Mahjot and Xiaobei, you have the floor.
Maybe I'll just kick off with just a few introductory remarks, and Xiaobei will make the presentation. Thank you very much, Sarah, and good morning, good evening, everyone. The Beijing University team, including myself and Xiaobei and other researchers, have produced a working paper on the impact of CBAM on other developing and emerging markets. And this is one angle that we are looking at the spillover effect of one particular climate policy coming out of the OECD countries. And the specific way we conduct this analysis is to use a dynamic CG model. We try to quantify the impact, which we believe is a contribution to this important discussion. And the finding shows that the CBAM, according to its current structure and possible design in the future, will have a spillover effect on emerging markets and developing countries, especially on some of the very vulnerable economies. And such impact may worsen income distribution and enlarging the income gap between OECD countries and these developing and emerging market economies. And that's why we are looking for solutions to minimize or mitigate such impact in case CBAM is indeed implemented. And one of such options is to develop some sort of fund which will use the revenue collected by CBAM and invest in developing country for assisting the energy transition and other green technology-related projects. So that's a very short overview. I'll pass it on to Xiaopei for the presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Ma. Thank you, Sarah. Dr. Ma Jun has already given an overview of the paper, so I'll just quickly walk you through the study and show you some charts of our findings. So the motivation to combat the climate change requires coordinated global efforts, but actually, as we all know, that the current making of climate policies is mostly led by developed countries. A case in point is the EU's upcoming Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM. The CBAM is designed to have global impact, but its distributional impact has been poorly studied. Many developing countries, especially lower income countries, rely heavily on carbon-intensive exports. So this is legitimate to ask, will developing countries be disproportionately burdened by those policies designed by the developed countries? Will those policies, such as CBAM, lead to macroeconomic instability in developing countries? So our research is to study the spillover transition risk of the EU's CBAM. We would like to provide a quantitative analysis of the potential impact on the growth and the stability of developing countries. And in the end, we derive policy implications for the IMF. We use a dynamic CG models to do the analysis. Just quickly go over the EU CBAM. The EU CBAM has been proposed by the Commission in July last year. In the initial proposal, there will be 5 sectors to be covered by the CBAM, which is iron and steel, cement, fertilizers, aluminium, and electricity. The CBAM will be coming to force in 2026. There will be like a 3 years transition period, and it should be applied to all non-EU countries except for the UK and Switzerland. In the initial plan, the CBAM will only cover a scope 1 emission, but by the end of the transition period, the EU will evaluate whether to cover indirect emission, therefore to extend it to scope 2 and scope 3. I will skip the literature. And we use GTAP 10 database to run the simulation. We set the EU carbon price to be $75 to run the simulation, which is a quite conservative assumption. When we calculate the tariff equivalence of the CBAM to be imposed by the EU, which is the difference between the carbon price in EU and the carbon price in the exporting country. We consider 2 scenarios. Scenario 1 is the current plan of the EU CBAM proposal, where we cover only scope 1 emission and 5 sectors. We also consider an extreme case, namely scenario 2, where the CBAM will be extended to scope 3 and will cover all sectors that has trading to the EU. So I'll just quickly show you some charts of our results. This is the results for scenario 1, where is the current proposal. We show the tariff equivalence of the CBAM. From the chart, you can see that the tariff equivalence for the 4 sectors, we exclude electricity in the chart because the impact on the electricity has been disproportionately large, so it's sort of like distorted charts, and only a few countries export electricity to the EU, so it's less relevant here. We only look at the other 4 sectors that to be covered by the C-band. So for those 4 sectors, one can see that the impact are quite significant, especially for countries such as India, Ukraine, Egypt, Russia, and China. And on the left-hand side, like Korea, the US, Japan, and Australia, and New Zealand, they also suffer from increase in the tariff equivalence, but the increase are relatively modest. And because of the increase in the tariff, the decline, we can see that there will be declines in the exports of those C-band products to the EU. And one can see that this the impact on the exports of India, Ukraine, and Egypt are mostly very significant. It's like more than 20 or 40 or even 60% decline in certain products. Even this is already in only in the scenario 1. So this is the result for scenario 2, which is a quite extreme case. We extend the C-band to all sectors. So I showed some selected sectors to show the impact here, namely textile, the pharmaceutical and rubber, plastic, machinery and electronic equipment, and motor vehicles. Those are very typical manufactured goods. One can also see that the impact on the exports of those goods from India, Russia, Ukraine, and China are significantly impacted. This is the tariff equivalence. And here is the results for the exports of those goods. And from the left-hand side, we can see that this is for Brazil, the US, Australia, and Japan, Korea. The impact on or the decline of the exports are relatively mild. But the impact on India, Russia, and China, and Ukraine are quite significant. So from the macroeconomic perspective, if you look at the impact on the GDP, of course, that depends on whether the country rely much on the exports of those goods to the EU. The results varies very significantly across countries. For example, if you compare scenario 1 under the assumption of scenario 1, Ukraine and Russia suffer from a significant decline in their GDP because they are major exporters of carbon-intensive goods to the EU. If you consider scenario 2, where it's an extreme case, the one stands out is Mozambique, because Mozambique is the major exporter of aluminium and steel to the EU, and those exports account for a very large share of GDP in Mozambique's economy. So to look at the welfare effects, we use equivalent variation, which is like consumers' income measured in denominated in $billion to measure the welfare gains and welfare losses of all those countries. So from this chart, one can see that China actually suffers from the largest welfare loss. This is in scenario 2. This is because China has the biggest exporting sector. India and Russia also suffers great welfare loss, both in scenario 1 and in scenario 2. So in scenario 2, actually the US also suffers from welfare loss, but it's quite modest in compared to its GDP size, it's the size of its economy. But for like Mozambique, Turkey, Egypt, and other developing countries, the welfare loss will be quite large in comparison to its the size of their economy. So from those results, we can see that the CBAM, the EU CBAM actually widens the gap between the developed and developing countries, sort of like has a negative distributional effects on the global economy. So we have can derive three policy implications for the IMF. The first, the IMF should assess and monitor the impact of CBAM on the balance of payment positions of vulnerable countries, because those countries, they are vulnerable to those spillover transition risk, also face a higher risk of balance of payment crisis, because this is affecting their import and exports. So the IMF should probably improve its bilateral and multilateral surveillance tool to first of all, to identify emerging risks and also help those vulnerable countries to cope with those risks. The second suggestion is to build capacity for vulnerable countries, because one of the major strengths of the IMF is in-house analytic capacity. And on the contrary, the vulnerable countries are often low-income developing countries with low capacity in analyzing and forecasting those effects of the external shocks on the growth, fiscal sustainability, and financial stability. Therefore, the IMF should provide valuable advice to those vulnerable countries to help them to forecast those risks. The third and the most important implications is that for the IMF is to help think or explore some policy options from the perspective of global coordinations. One of these options is to set up an equitable decarbonization fund funded by the CBAM revenues. So, so the large share of the CBAM revenues that has been collected from developing countries can be returned to the developing countries to help them to decarbonize. There are at least two approaches one can explore to run those funds. The first one is to use the fund as a catalyst, to use some de-risking facilities and other blended finance instruments to crowd in larger private capital for green and low carbon investments in the developing countries. The second approach is to, for the fund to run, is to invest in green and low carbon technologies with good potential to be adopted by developing countries. This is because the developing countries typically have limited access to those low carbon technologies. So to invest in those technology will be able to maximize the benefits for the developing countries. So I will stop here. Thank you, and comments welcome.
Thank you, Mahjot and Heishabe. Dr. Mahjot, I think we have lost you on camera in case you want to come back. Yes, so thank you to both of you for illustrating to us the impacts of spillover risks through an analysis of what CBAM could mean for developing countries, and most importantly, for the recommendations that you have proposed. And next we turn to Rakesh Mohan for his presentation on fiscal impacts of net zero transitions. Rakesh, you have the floor. And sir, you're on mute.
Thank you very much, Sarah Jane, and thank you to the Global Development Policy Center of Boston University for including us in this task force. I'm afraid I don't have slides, which means that all the participants have listened to me carefully to be able to carry home what I'm saying, and I hope it'll be of some use. So first, just a very first general comment that, and this is kind of obvious, that the world will be going through a very major energy transition, which is all this is all about, over the next 10 to 50 years. And I'm saying 10 to 50 years because immediate targets are 2030. And then, for example, India's net zero target is at 2070. So that's why I'm saying 10 to 50 years. And this kind of transition hasn't, in some sense, taken place for about 150 years. That is, the first transition like this happened when fossil fuels came into operation in the late 19th century, particularly to do with oil, and then, of course, kept on increasing. So this is something very new that's happening. And that is why there's a lot of uncertainty around what's going to happen. And that's why this kind of a task force is very important, particularly from the macro point of view. The other second general point I want to make is that the developing countries and emerging markets are faced by a triple financial stroke fiscal challenge. First, that unlike developed countries, whose growth is not expected to continue at high rate, if at all. In the case of developing countries and emerging markets, there's need to ensure continuing growth, but on an equitable and sustained basis. So just to give an illustration from India, that at present, the Indian per capita income is only around $2,000 per capita. That's in nominal dollars, not PPP. Now, even if we grow at 7% a year per capita income, which would be a very high rate of growth, say, for the next 20 years, even then in 2040, our per capita income at today's dollars would be around $8,000, which is less than where China is today. And so the point is only to make, the point is only that for India and for other developing countries, other emerging markets, you can't just say, look, no, I don't want to go any further now. That's not an option. And therefore, we will need, as best as we can, to continue growing so that poverty is reduced or eliminated, certainly, and to ensure equitable and sustainable growth. So there's going to be very significant that if we do grow at anything like 5% a year, 7% a year, whatever, in terms of per capita income growth, there's going to be significant growth in energy demand, very clearly. And of course, urbanization will take place correspondingly, so energy demand will increase correspondingly. And so what is interesting for India is that, I guess, partly because of better efficiency, and partly perhaps because the last decade growth was somewhat slower than the previous decade, the growth in energy demand was only around 4% a year, all energy combined. But my expectation is that if we step up our overall economic growth, actually energy demand will grow more than 4% a year. And again, other countries might have similar numbers. In fact, if we grow at 7% a year, I would imagine that that is per capita, the total energy demand might grow at 5-6% a year, something of that order. Hence, even on a business as usual basis, there will be very substantial investment needed just to ensure adequate energy supply. And similar, as I said, the situation would be similar in other emerging markets and developing countries if they're continuing to grow. Second, again, big challenge for developing countries, emerging markets and developing countries, is that along with this high growth in demand for energy and therefore ensuring supply, we'll be going through a simultaneous transition in energy to renewables, whether it's solar, wind, hydrogen, hydro. Now, one difference between the renewable sources of energy in terms of investment with the conventional sources is that the fixed costs or the investment costs are much higher than the variable costs. And therefore, higher upfront investment will be required for supplying the same enhanced flow of energy relative to conventional sources like coal or others. So there's a double problem that not only do we have to keep investing just to ensure adequate supply, but if there's a simultaneous transition taking place to renewables, it means a higher investment requirements to have the same enhanced flow of energy. Third challenge, and this is certainly true for India, I'm not sure how much it is true for other countries, but I would imagine there'll be something similar. I've not have seen in papers on similar kind of calculations. Now, in the case of India, we have a heavy reliance on revenues emanating from fossil fuels in different ways, coal, petrol, diesel, etc., in many different ways, which have been enumerated in some detail in the paper that we have done for the task force. I'm not going to go into the details, but just to say that, look, there are heavy taxes in different ways, also royalties, also dividends from public sector companies, etc. So if you put all that combined, that the total revenue at present, last couple of years, 3 years, amounts to something like 3.2% of GDP, which is around 13% of total revenue. That's a very large number. 13% of total revenue and 3.2% of GDP. To get a sense of what this means is, it is twice the total defense expenditure of India. Okay, just the revenues coming from fossil fuels is twice the revenue, is twice the total expenditure on defense. Or to get another on the other side, and so get another fix on it, it is roughly equal to the total expenditure by the central government and state governments combined on education, sports, art, culture, etc. Mainly, which means really mainly education. So this is a very large number in terms of how much revenue that we are getting from fossil fuels. The current projections, which again the details are there in our paper, suggest that if we transition to the green energy, and there are different kind of projections, obviously, I'm just giving one projection, that if in 2020, 13.3% or 13% odd of total revenues were coming from fossil fuels, if we do the kind of transition that we are planning, then that will drop by almost half to about 7.5, 7.6% of total revenue. By 2040, around 4%. In terms of GDP proportions, it'll go down from 3.2% in 2020 to 1.8% of GDP into 2030 and 1% 2040. So the point of all these calculations is that this is a huge challenge. That is, not only are we talking about much higher investment requirements for business as usual energy investment. Second, as I mentioned, larger investment because it's more capital intensive, and there's the fixed cost to variable cost is much higher for renewable energy. In addition to all the higher requirements for expenditure, we're going to take a major hit on revenues coming from fossil fuels. And again, as I said, I have not studied other countries, but I imagine there'll be some similar kind of issues in other countries as well. Now, therefore, obviously, it means you need to do something with carbon taxes. And so we'll have to try and do calculations, which we've not done yet, on what kind of reasonable carbon taxes would it be feasible to do. And of course, find other substitute revenues, because that'll have to be done. And actually, the problem is much worse, because as we continue to grow in terms of GDP per capita and overall GDP, in fact, revenue as a proportion of GDP will have to keep going upwards overall. As we know, developed countries have much higher ratios of revenue, tax revenue to GDP. So the point is that this is, as I said, a triple challenge, that not only do we have to find resources for new investment, but existing revenues, as far as the government and public sector is concerned, are going to go down, and we'll have to struggle to find equivalent revenues, or in fact more, from other sources. So as I said, there'll be a challenge to finance business as usual investment in energy, bigger challenge to finance investment in green energy. And then, of course, from the public finance side, that how much of all these different needs for investment will come from the public sector, and how much from the private sector. Second, if you're going to do this relatively rapid transition to green energy, then would we also have to be doing subsidies for incentives to transfer to green investment? Third, in terms of these challenges, international transfers. Now, I won't go into any numbers because there have been many different estimates emanating from COP26, also calculations by Nobel, from people like Lord Nick Stern and so on, that I'm not going to any of those numbers, but I wanted to make a macro point which is very seldom made. The very large numbers that are being bandied around from different sources are really very, very large numbers in terms of required transfers from international sources to developing countries and emerging markets. And the one thing, the macro part that has not been looked at is that whenever you have large cross-border transfers, whether it's public sector or government or multilateral agencies, whether it's private sector equity or debt, on a macro basis, you can't absorb whatever is coming in unless your current account deficit is equal to the capital flows that are coming in. Now, to the extent that in business as usual, so the current situation, in the case of India, for example, our total net capital flows are around 2% or less of GDP. And these are large numbers, okay, net, which means gross is much higher, all right? Now, what this means is that if you look at the kind of numbers that are being talked about, it's a much higher number than, say, the total current account deficit of all developing countries and emerging markets combined. So that's a real macro issue, that if all that external transfer actually comes, which it won't, but if it comes, it can't be absorbed actually. And what does that mean? There has to be much more domestic raising of resources. And to my mind, this has not been looked at all. And I think that as was being suggested in the last presentation, is the kind of thing the IMF, and I've not seen IMF papers either on this, the macro balance of payment balance implications of the kind of transfers we are talking about. That's a clear core job of the IMF. And then to say, look, this is not feasible, or what is feasible for that matter, or how do we find ways and means of absorbing that stuff? And I don't think you can actually, without really expanding current account deficits. If you expand the current account deficit, those private flows certainly won't come, because you can clearly see if you expand the current account deficit, you're going to have a balance of payments crisis. Some of the other papers also for the task force, the major issues arising is to do with debt sustainability analysis. Again, that's something the IMF does very well. And just connected what I was just saying, that if you're going to increase the liabilities of developing countries or emerging markets because of large incremental flows, whether it's equity or debt, whether it's multilateral, private, or bilateral, the implication is still that you're going to get very little free money like grants. It'll be either equity or debt. And all that increases the liability of the countries concerned. And one of the calculations that have been done in the background papers is that if you combine the decline in revenues with greater expenditure, one of the papers' calculations suggests debt will go up 200% of GDP. If that happens, there's no way that the countries can survive. I mean, Japan has 250% or something of GDP as their total debt, but because most of Japanese debt is in fact domestic, it's not making a big effect. And of course, they have just about zero interest rates. And that's not the case for no developing country emerging market can survive in international markets, I would say, if the debt to GDP ratio goes much above 100%. So this is a real problem in terms of, again, what I was saying, if the international transfers required to finance green energy take place. So I think that there has to be much more serious macro work on what would be the role of multilaterals. Now, we have to remember that IMF does not give grants. IMF does not give development loans. IMF is there to rescue you when you come into trouble. So on a lighter note, one can say maybe IMF is welcoming this happening because they'll be much more in business. If the liabilities of emerging markets and developing countries increase a lot, they'll have more and more crises, so IMF will have a lot of business. That's much more on a lighter note. But the point is that, look, the implications for the kind of transfers we're talking about, whether it's in equity, whether it is in debt, is going to make huge increases in the debt liabilities of emerging markets and developing countries. How is that going to manage? Second, of course, what kind of private sector investments can come, whether in debt or equity, what will be sustainable from a macro point of view? And finally, of course, what I talked about earlier, the domestic, how can developing countries, emerging markets raise greater public finance, whether it's in taxes or whether it's taxes or otherwise, or what do we have to do for capital markets and emerging markets and developing economies to be able to finance the kind of stuff we're talking about? I hope I've not gone on too long, but I always have that problem if I have a stream of consciousness that I just had.
Thank you, Rakesh. No, you didn't go too long. Thank you. And thank you for the perspective from India on the energy transition, the importance of alternative revenue sources, and the implications of such international transfers. And finally, we are pleased now to welcome a commentary from Laurence Toubiana. Laurence, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want first to really acknowledge the excellent quality of all these papers, these background papers. I enjoy enormously reading them. And just listening carefully as Rakesh has asked for, and the two first presentation of Mahjot, Shabay, and Rakesh, I can say that the insight first on CBAM, on the background paper on CBAM is of course very interesting. There are avenues of cooperation through this background paper, which I think many in EU are considering, in particular for the lower income countries, which, and I will be of course interested and curious if you have gone through your CGA model to not only, of course, the emerging one and some cases like Egypt, or if you have access as well to the impact on the lower side, and in particular, these V20 group countries. But I think it's really very, very thoughtful and interesting. And I was, in a way, thinking that at least one IMF paper was interesting on trying to see what could be a reasonable level playing field in terms of carbon pricing that could be as well an avenue for and of course we evidently see that this carbon price cannot be the same in all countries given the very, very different level of development, but that may be interesting as well, which in a way connect with Rakesh thinking about how you leverage more public finance in developing countries. The second remark, again, as listening to the presentation, and I will go for a little bit more general comments. I think I agree 100% with Rakesh's comment of the absence of serious macroeconomic analysis. And I can tell of this big transformation we are going through. And if we want to be net zero for some countries much earlier, some countries later. And this enormous amount of investment is still not integrated into most of the macroeconomic analysis. And it is true in Europe, it's just starting, but really, really very imperfect. And of course, I understand even more in many other countries that are just starting to reflect on how they will get there. So that's very true that the IMF should take a responsibility with all these factors of the balance of payments as well as investment cost. And I was very sensitive to Rakesh's element of the absorption capacity. And we know if finally this investment plan were in a way will be fulfilled, and if there will be this rapid increase of international financial flow, whether of course private and public, we may see absolutely a macroeconomic impact that will be damaging, in particular, of course, potential inflation. And of course, at the end of the day, some kind of liability and debt increase in some cases. So we are in face of a challenge about that, but I do think first that for the moment, the IMF coming in, and that's why your work globally on the task force is so precious. It's just very, very behind all the realities. And even now, when, of course, looking at the targets of the Paris Agreement, we should absolutely increase the thinking and understand what is feasible, the debt sustainability, etc. So 100%, it's a very important work. I must say this work is lacking everywhere. It was like climate was something else. It was not in the economy. And now, of course, we have to recognize it is about absolutely public resources, finance stability, and that many central bankers are now thinking about. And at the same time, could be a lot of social impact we have to take in account if we want to go, which we should all aspire to much balanced and more equitable and sustainable growth. So on all this, really commending the two background paper and the presentation. And I was, in a way, just some additional remarks. I do think that we have made some progress, and in a way, we have a financial system, in particular the multilateral one, which is built after the crisis of the World War II, which is, in my view, totally inadequate to the challenges we are facing. And the institutional disconnect between it is obvious in the SDR issue, for example. There are some level of recognition, and it was so difficult to get. And I know you have been all working a lot on that, on the emission of new special drawing rights and their reallocation. But the way they are allocated must change, and there is momentum, in my view, for this. Of course, the IMF allocation of SDR was an important part of the global response to the pandemic. There is huge potential to develop new tools for the resilience of our macroeconomic system. But of course, we have now to integrate the climate being the most macro-critical risk of all, and in particular on the impact side and the loss and damages side. So the RST is an excellent initiative. I don't know how quick and agile it will be. Can it be lead to a deeper institutional shift? Can the IMF be much more attentive to the needs of the most vulnerable countries and of course that group, and that's why in a way the representation, I will come back to that later, is so important. The countries which need SDR the most because their economy are drained are the ones with least say in the reallocation discussion. And for example, we could float the idea that the V20 become an official political group at the IMF. 55 vulnerable developing countries, including small island developing states and nations, are lacking totally representation. And as many of you, we have been listening to Barbara Motley, Prime Minister of Barbados, brilliantly re-elected recently. And I think we could not but listen very carefully to her call. So, and in a way, my own experience is that at COP21, this serious representation and voice of the vulnerable developing countries has done a lot of impact in the success. The process was really designed to elevate the voice of the most vulnerable, in particular on the High Ambition Coalition. And in a way, that's the way to keep the multilateral system as honest as possible. I'm not surprised that the G20 cannot deliver on that. It's already a progress in terms of representation, but it doesn't figure out really the needs of this particular set of countries, which for some of them are in a really great problem now with escalating debt. So integration of climate consideration in every IMF operation needs to be scaled up quickly. This is a challenge of our time. I see some central bankers, in a way, calling for that, including central bankers that are in developing countries. So I think they will bring their point, which is very, very central for understanding the challenge. But the debt sustainability assessment, as in your study points out, the IMF is really lacking data and analysis to help countries enhance their fiscal space for the necessary massive investment in adaptation and mitigation. And I see that, and I don't know how there is a connection or a disconnect because I haven't been really looking and not traveling so much these last years, of course, just to understand how the dialogue between IMF teams and governments and the finance ministers of the developing countries and the low-income countries in particular has unfolded, and is a recommendation of the fiscal space take into account the need of investment. And in a way, some proposals on the green public finance here by IMF staff, I think the climate sensitive management of public finance, green, I think will be an interesting element. We have to change the culture of IMF as well, I must say, as the World Bank and many multilateral development banks. It is true of the comprehensive surveillance review. Design of the RST needs to be attractive enough. I'm hearing already some governments say, we will never go there. It doesn't, of course, it seems cheap as a resource. Anyway, it will be an asset reserve. We cannot do a lot. Maybe it will. So it has to be attractive enough so it becomes a real lever for countries to invest in the transition and to mobilize domestic resources. And finally, the IMF has a role to play to push for a new multilateral framework on debt resolution and restructuration, one that integrates climate change risk and opportunities. And most of the time, we have a sort of short-term solution, short-term fixes, in particular, of course, delay of the repayments on the debt service, but it's not that what we need. We need to look at the debt. And in particular, I was thinking about the small island states, but it could be the same as the case in Bangladesh, for example. So loss and damages linked to climate impacts is making, it increases the debt every year. When you have to rebuild and to repay infrastructure which has been destroyed regularly by climate impacts. So that needs a different understanding on the debt restructuration. The G20 have failed to do so until now. The IMF can be bold to propose new ideas, and I hope at the spring meetings, of course, it's just next week, we see some ideas popping up, and that's, I think, why I want to thank you for this contribution ahead of these meetings. 73 countries eligible for the debt service suspension initiative were already vulnerable when the DSSI was established in 2020. So even now, they are much more exposed to turbulence just with the increased inflation they will be facing on many other imports. Should seed framework be expanded to more countries, even change, especially given risking the risk of emerging market and developing country debt and not just vulnerable DSSI countries? We have, of course, to think about that. And across Africa, and I've been recently participating to a discussion around the EU-Africa Summit, and many African leaders, again, say some things that you all know, that still they borrow at very expensive price for their investment, much beyond 5%, with a maturity time period, which is absolutely incompatible and inconsistent of any investment plan. And look at across Africa, the external borrowing costs are rising and bond spreads are up by an average of 20 basis points. So one, there is this macro analysis with the actual situation that already is shaky and need to be addressed properly. But on top of that, and following the excellent presentation, we have now to integrate in the macro perspective the climate change, because it has to be central to any global debt workout. And finally, I would like to spend some minutes on resilience. One of the key themes that emerge from all your work is resilience and the need to build resilience against the macroeconomic impact generated by policy adopted in other countries. Russia's sanction on energy and commodity price also comes to mind on top of the rest. And the need to have resilient public finance that can withstand the revenue base shifting away from fossil fuels. I think the papers also raise tough question on mobilizing resources. The papers show how net zero pathway can lead to drastic declines in public revenue, especially for fossil fuel exporters. I was remembering discussion with the Minister of Finance of Saudi Arabia years ago, and he was telling that they cannot balance the budget if the barrel is lower than $80 per barrel. So you mean they are heavily dependent on the volatility of prices. And at the same time, this was there much before any strategy into diversifying their economy. So the declines come exactly when government need to significantly increase climate investment. So that's why IMF, as that was said at the last presentation, has an important role to play here with MDBs mobilizing resources for the structural transformation. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurence, for your perspective and your reflection for the two presentations today. And with that, we have about 9 minutes for Q&A, and I'll read off the first question I see, and this is from the Save the Children US. Given the scale of the financial challenges, the political difficulties involved in agreeing on various possible financial mechanisms, and the urgent deadline over 10 years, sorry, less than 10 years, do the panelists think that the global transition to a low carbon economy and the 1.5 degrees target with the time we have remaining is practically reachable? Can you put a probability or estimate on the likelihood? This is a challenging question, I'm sure, and I open it up to any of the panelists to answer.
If I may, as in a way, a person just surveying the life of the Paris Agreement, there is one point. Of course, we frankly these days we don't know if we can achieve that. We have possibilities. We have real possibilities with this mobilization of massive resources and the way they manage has to be delivered. But what I think is the growth where all developing countries are aspiring very rightly to will be impossible if the impact of climate change increase. So the destruction, in particular in agriculture, in infrastructure, and health and public health concern, to say some, is really a major, it's a major, maybe at least some economists are describing that, a major creates a major impossibility for this 7% of growth, which is needed for many countries at world level and for many million and million of people. So how we do that in a way that allows this growth to happen as quick as possible, but preventing this disaster of climate change to happen. So I do see on my side that when developed countries have to accelerate enormously the decarbonization plans, but that will not be enough. So that's why the investment discussion we have had before is so crucial.
Yeah. Thank you, Laurence. Mahjot, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Just to add on this topic, I think the challenge is mainly with the developing countries. For OECD countries that we can see with a lot of fiscal resources, and with a very strong financial sector that's committing to net zero and very low funding costs relative to developing countries. So the bigger problem we should focus on is how to finance the climate transition in a very large part of developing country emerging markets, which doesn't have the necessary funding either domestically or internationally. And some of the emerging markets are looking for financing for their renewable, and I know some of these countries are facing a funding cost of 15%. And you know that renewable projects are largely capital intensive, and the funding costs actually determine whether such a project can survive. So really we need a lot of measures to help them to access low cost funding and reduce funding cost. One of the things we need to consider seriously is to expand the MDB's de-risking facility for developing country emerging markets. I know many of these facilities actually work very well from the previous experience of the World Bank, IFC, ADB, and so on. The scale of these facilities are very, very small relative to the total operation of the MDB. There is a problem in the internal design of the mechanism of how the MDB allocating resources. I think they should allocate much more in the blended financing facility, de-risking facilities, and so on to help emerging markets.
Thank you, Marjorie. And now I'll pass on to Rakesh.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah Jane. I just want to make 2 points on this, actually. In a way, there are two kinds of issues for which developing countries need resources. One, large developing countries like India and China and others, the large ones, their emissions affect global warming for the world as a whole. And therefore, it is important for the world as a whole to be concerned with what large countries like us do in terms of climate change mitigation. On the other side, many of the smaller countries, which is the majority of developing countries in emerging markets, how much they emit is not as important for the world as a whole. But they're going to be affected, maybe disproportionately, by the impact of climate change. And so they need to take measures to protect themselves from the impact of global climate change, for which large, both developed and developing large countries like ours will be responsible for. So my point is that in some sense, for the whole large, I don't know how many countries, maybe 100 small emerging markets, developing countries, it's not as large a problem for global resources to be raised to help them deal with the impact of climate change. It's a much bigger problem, as I was indicating, to figure out what kind of resources the large countries need, which actually affect climate change as a whole. Like, again, I would say like India, China, etc. And in the latter sense, in the first sense, small developing countries, emerging markets, for whom resources have to be raised to mitigate climate change impacts on them, it seems to me the multilaterals, World Bank, ADB, IDB, etc., African Development Bank, can all get together to figure out what needs to be done, how to raise those resources, plus the IMF for risk mitigation, etc. On the other side, that is helping large countries like ourselves, we need to do much more realistic estimations of what resources are needed and where they will come from, as I was indicating earlier in my intervention. And so I think that we need to sort of separate out these two, actually.
Thank you, Rakesh, as well, for the feedback. And I see a question on the chat from Aftab. I'm not sure if this is quite a question as a statement. It's important also to look at the IMF loan facilities and linkages with climate change. For instance, in Pakistan, in the Pakistan IMF loan agreement, it negatively impacted the renewable energy market due to dismantling of tax breaks. So I see this is more of a comment. So thank you, Aftab, for your comment. And with that, colleague, yes. Right. Yeah, and with that, colleagues, I think we are running out of time. So I suggest that if there are further questions, to add it to the chat, and Task Force Boston University colleagues could respond after this event. And now, last but not least, I turn over the floor to Marie-Louise for closing remarks. You're on mute. Marie-Louise, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Okay. Well, thank you, Sarah. It's a privilege to participate in today's excellent panel. I really think the discussion was very insightful. Let me start my closing remarks with reiterating an aspiration of developing countries, that as the world accelerates actions to address the threat of climate change, it is essential that these efforts lead to opportunities to improve livelihoods, boost growth, and overcome poverty. But we need to understand better what it will take to develop these pathways that will jointly tackle development and climate. And the discussion today shows just how difficult that can be. Policymakers will need to be better equipped to understand the extent of the macro and development challenges that will accompany climate transitions at the country level. Such effort will clearly require a lot of work, capacity building, and financing, especially in developing countries. As the speakers mentioned, the IMF can play a particularly critical role to making these possible, assessing macroeconomic risks as they arise and as they emerge, and collaborate well with other international financial institutions. This leads me to my first key takeaway, which is how well the two papers discussed today illustrate the value of deeper and more granular analysis of the macroeconomic consequences of climate transitions. Rakesh spoke about the enormous investment needs to scale up renewable energy to meet domestic demand. That is a concern of pretty much most developing countries. The study of fiscal impact of climate actions in India shows that this concern is actually even more serious because the climate transition itself also adversely and directly affects fiscal revenues and decreases fiscal space. This is an added dimension of transition costs that have not been typically seen in macroeconomic assessments, and it is quite likely that other developing countries will face the same trend. Now, even more enlightening is the examination of the mix of domestic resources mobilization policies, the revenue sources, and domestic taxation, including policies that are typically recommended by the IMF and other institutions that are clearly not easy to put together and nor will yield enough to match the fiscal adjustment required. So what to do? There is evidently tremendous value in gathering the data and undertaking the analysis to get a better handle of the scope of the transition cost, which then informs efforts to evaluate feasible policy mixes, and then eventually the external financial needs that would actually be needed to finance the transition within a good growth path. There is a lot of promise in further work on India, as the task force is doing, and other developing countries. And there's one currently being pursued in Latin America within the task force, and probably more so later. The analysis could be extended as well to assess the eventual impact on growth and pace of climate actions and policy trade-offs that policymakers will have to make given their constraints. Now, the study of the spillover effects on EU's CBAM provides a very serious nudge to examine the mechanism's impact on balance of payments and growth, especially in lower income vulnerable countries. There's evident apprehension in the concerns expressed by some exporter developing countries on the potential adverse economic impacts of the cross-border mechanism on their exports to Europe, considering as part of the solution the creation of a financing mechanism funded by the proceeds of CBAM adds to the important debate on how to finance just climate transitions and avoid disproportionate harm on developing countries. And more could be done to assess the spillover effects of climate policies broadly in systemically important countries. As speakers pointed out, the study signaled the need to revisit existing macroeconomic and financial risk assessment models and enhance the data available actually to better include the medium and long-term impacts of climate actions, climate finance, and what to do at the country level to manage transition so that growth is enhanced and not impeded. I agree that the IMF is well positioned to analyze and should be doing so the implications and balance of payments, risks, and debt vulnerabilities as the climate transition deepens and as financing needs increase enormously in developing countries. As Mahjot and Shelby pointed out, the IMF has an important role to play to catalyze actions to mitigate spillover risks. My next and final point, developing countries, including the countries in the group of 24, call for a global commitment to significantly increase the quantity and improve the quality of climate finance. But as you know, available and expected climate financing at this point still falls far short of what is needed. But an added value of more granular analysis of fiscal impacts and spillover impacts might be to illustrate explicitly the financing gaps at the country level. How much can be funded domestically, alternative sources of external financing that can be affordably extended to developing countries, and even the absorption capacity of developing countries. Perhaps knowing the scale of transition requirements and financing gaps, and the growth and climate potential offered at the country level by bridging these gaps might provide better impetus for developed countries, multilateral development banks, and the private sector to work on scaling up climate financing appropriately for developing countries. So let me close with that. Thank you, Sarah, over to you.
Thank you, Mary Lou, and thank you to our panelists for sharing their thoughts with us today, and thank you to everyone who joined this important discussions. We, the task force, look forward to continuing this discussion with IMF member governments, with management and staff, and the magnitude of stakeholders working to align the financial system with climate and development goals. To receive updates on publications and events by the task force on climate development and the IMF, you can subscribe in the link located in the chat box. This talk has also been recorded on YouTube, and we will share the link in the chat. Thank you. And